I never thought a family gathering could turn into the worst day of my life. One moment, I was laughing with relatives in my grandmother's sunlit living room, and the next, I was gasping in pain, clutching shattered ribs, as my own cousin swung a baseball bat at me. Grandma begged me not to make a scene, whispering that family problems should stay inside the house. But the CT scan later told a different story, one that no amount of pleading could hide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lena Marquez, and I've always been close to my extended family. Growing up in the quiet town of Willow Creek, family gatherings were my favorite part of the year. Summers meant warm sunlight spilling through Grandma's kitchen windows, the smell of freshly baked empanadas, and the sounds of laughter bouncing off the walls. My cousins were like siblings to me, even though we were all a little scattered in age and personality. Among them, Jason, my older cousin, always had this intense energy. He was competitive, passionate, and sometimes reckless. But I never imagined that one day that same energy would turn violent. I didn't go to these reunions expecting danger. I went seeking comfort and connection. That illusion shattered completely on the day of my 16th birthday party, hosted at Grandma's sprawling, slightly worn house at the edge of town. The morning started normal enough. I arrived early, helping Grandma set the table with plates and cutlery she had been polishing all week. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, her two dogs padding along my heels as I carried bowls of fruit into the dining room. I could hear the hum of the oven and the distant sound of traffic along the quiet streets outside. My parents were still at work, and it was just me, Grandma, and a handful of cousins trickling in one by one. I noticed Jason immediately. He had a tense set to his jaw, and his eyes darted around the room as if he were bracing for something. I chalked it up to typical teenage awkwardness, but looking back, it was a warning I didn't recognize at the time. By noon, the house was alive with energy. Music played softly from the living room speakers, cousins argued over seating arrangements, and Grandma scurried from kitchen to dining room like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. Everyone seemed cheerful, but the air had a subtle edge. Jason kept hovering near me, sometimes leaning over my shoulder in a way that felt unnerving, muttering remarks that didn't make sense. I laughed it off at first, attributing it to his usual teasing, the kind that had always been part of our dynamic. I should have trusted that unease growing in my chest, but I didn't. I had always seen Jason as someone I could handle, a cousin I could reason with if needed. That day would test the limits of that belief. After lunch, the kids wanted to play in the backyard, and I followed reluctantly. Grandma had warned us not to climb the old oak tree that marked the edge of the yard, but the allure was irresistible. I watched as the younger cousins scrambled up the branches, cheering each other on. Jason stayed behind, fidgeting near the shed that held old sports equipment. He pulled out a baseball bat, polishing it with a rag as if preparing for some ritual. My curiosity piqued. I asked what he was doing, and he smirked, shrugging it off as nothing serious. I had no idea then that nothing serious would soon change my life forever. The first spark of tension came when I accidentally bumped into him near the shed, knocking the bat slightly. His reaction was instantaneous, anger flashing in his eyes, his face red with fury. I stumbled back, apologizing, trying to diffuse what I thought was just a fleeting temper. But Jason didn't stop. He took a step closer, raising the bat in a way that made my stomach knot. Before I could react, he swung. Pain exploded across my chest, and I fell to the ground gasping for air. The sound of the bat hitting bone echoed through the backyard. My dogs barked frantically, and time seemed to freeze as I struggled to comprehend what had just happened. My ribs felt as if they had been shattered, each breath a knife twisting deeper. I wanted to scream, to run, to call for help, but Grandma's voice cut through the chaos. Trembling and urgent, "Lena, don't make a scene. Stay still." Her hands shook as she tried to hold me upright, her eyes darting toward the other cousins who had frozen in horror. I felt torn between trusting her instinct to calm things down and my own rising fear. Jason didn't run or apologize. He just stood there, breathing heavily, eyes wild. He muttered something about it being an accident and then walked off toward the house, leaving me writhing on the ground. My cousins finally reacted, rushing over to help, their hands pressing against my sides where every touch made me wince. Grandma hovered, alternating between soothing whispers and scolding glances, telling everyone to calm down and keep quiet. It was surreal. Pain radiating through my chest, the sound of my shallow breaths filling my ears, and my grandma urging me to pretend nothing had happened. But the truth was undeniable. I needed help, and there was no way to hide it. By the time my parents arrived, I was barely able to speak. The drive to the hospital felt endless, each bump of the car sending shocks of pain through my ribs. I clutched the small hospital gown against my chest, my vision blurred with tears and adrenaline. In the emergency room, the nurse's concerned glance and the doctor's sharp questions broke through Grandma's earlier insistence on secrecy. They quickly ordered a CT scan, the machine humming ominously as it confirmed my worst fears. Multiple rib fractures, some displaced, all consequent. The scan made this scene that Grandma had begged me to avoid undeniable. Pain and fear mingled with a shocking realization. The danger wasn't just from the swing itself, it was the denial, the insistence on silence that had allowed this to happen. Sitting in that sterile hospital room, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Jason's temper had crossed a line that could never be ignored, and Grandma's protective instincts, though rooted in love, had inadvertently put me at further risk. I felt a mix of betrayal, hurt, and confusion. Family, the people I had always trusted, had become the arena for violence and denial. I realized, even as the pain pulsed through me with each breath, that this story wasn't going to stay hidden. The CT scan had already made it real, and no amount of pleading could undo that. That day would mark the beginning of a journey I had never anticipated. A path toward truth, confrontation, and ultimately survival. After the hospital visit, the world around me felt simultaneously unchanged and entirely foreign. Grandma had insisted on taking me home after a day of monitoring, claiming the fractures weren't life-threatening, but the pain was a constant reminder that something within the family dynamic had broken irreparably. The CT scan images haunted my thoughts, each one a stark black and white proof of my vulnerability and the violence that had erupted from someone I had trusted. In the quiet of my bedroom, I lay propped up on pillows, ribcage tender to the slightest touch, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint sounds of neighborhood children playing outside. I had always thought family was a sanctuary, a place where laughter and comfort outweighed conflict. Now, I wasn't sure I knew what family meant anymore. Grandma tried to downplay the incident the next morning, her voice soft and coaxing as she reminded me to keep the family's peace and avoid mentioning what had happened. She helped me dress, carried meals to my bedside, and even smiled faintly as she suggested that perhaps Jason hadn't meant to hurt me. But her words rang hollow against the reality that my ribs were fractured, my body bruised, and my trust fractured even more. I felt caught between my loyalty to Grandma, who had raised me since my parents worked long hours, and my own instinct to protect myself. I knew that if I stayed silent, there would be no acknowledgement of the harm, no accountability, and no protection if something like this happened again. The emotional weight was suffocating, and I spent long stretches staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the images from the CT scan with the people I had always considered safe. Life outside the house continued in its ordinary rhythm, which only heightened my sense of isolation. School was difficult. Every cough, laugh, or sudden movement sent sharp jolts through my ribs. Teachers noticed my quiet demeanor, and classmates whispered when they saw me gingerly navigating the hallways. Some friends asked what happened, and I deflected, muttering vague stories about a minor accident at home. The truth felt too heavy, too raw to share. I didn't want anyone imagining my cousin swinging a bat at me, especially not when my own grandma seemed intent on burying the incident. I had always prided myself on being strong, capable of handling conflict with reason and calm, But this was different. The violence wasn't a misunderstanding or a heated argument. It was deliberate, and it had left me physically and emotionally scarred. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Returning to Grandma's house for visits became a minefield of tension and silent reminders of what had happened. Jason avoided eye contact, offering half-hearted apologies that felt rehearsed, like lines from a script. Other cousins tiptoed around the subject, unsure whether to acknowledge the fracture or pretend nothing had occurred. The unspoken rules were suffocating, a web of denial that only made me more aware of the danger that had lurked in plain sight. I learned quickly which rooms to enter, where to sit, and when to avoid certain conversations, adopting a strategy of careful observation and measured participation. Even Grandma, in her efforts to maintain harmony, became an unwitting enforcer of secrecy, reinforcing a culture where the truth was inconvenient, even dangerous. Despite the undercurrent of fear, I refused to let the injury define me. Physical therapy and careful movement became my new routine, and I found solace in writing about the experience in a small journal I kept hidden in my bedside drawer. Every entry captured the conflicting emotions: anger at Jason's actions, confusion over Grandma's insistence on silence, and the helplessness that came with realizing that family loyalty sometimes meant complicity in harm. My journal became both a refuge and a record, a way to remind myself that the story of what happened would not vanish simply because others wished it so. Every word was a quiet assertion of agency, a small act of resistance against the narrative of denial that surrounded me.
Tension mounted further when Jason's behavior began shifting in subtle but alarming ways. He would linger near me, his expressions oscillating between guilt and irritation. Sometimes he apologized in private, voice low and unsteady, but other times he laughed off the incident as if it were insignificant. The unpredictability kept me on edge, a constant reminder that the threat was not fully neutralized. My cousins noticed the strain, some expressing concern in whispered conversations behind closed doors. Their worry was genuine, but none of them dared challenge the household rules Grandma had established. I realized that while I was physically recovering, the psychological battle was only beginning. Learning to navigate this new, precarious reality became a daily exercise in caution, patience, and observation. Meanwhile, Grandma continued to act as both protector and barrier, often making statements that left me frustrated and conflicted. She would admonish Jason quietly in one moment, then immediately urge me to let it go in the next, emphasizing that family unity was paramount. I understood her intentions were rooted in love, but they were blind to the practical reality that if Jason's actions went unchecked, there was a real risk of repetition. I began to notice other family patterns I had previously overlooked: small manipulations, avoidance tactics, and a tendency to silence uncomfortable truths. It became clear that the incident with Jason was symptomatic of a deeper dynamic, one that had allowed harm to occur without accountability. Recognizing this pattern was painful, but it also sparked a determination to ensure that my voice could not be ignored indefinitely. Over the following weeks, I began documenting everything: the day of the injury, my conversations with Grandma, Jason's apologies, and the subtle shifts in household tension. I kept photos of my bruises, records of medical visits, and written accounts of each interaction that felt relevant. I knew instinctively that if the situation escalated, there needed to be an objective record of what had happened. This meticulous gathering of evidence was both empowering and exhausting, a quiet rebellion against the culture of secrecy that had dominated my family life. Each note, photo, and observation was a step toward reclaiming agency, a reminder that the truth could not be erased simply by ignoring it. By the time the month ended, the fractures in my ribs had begun to heal, but the emotional scars remained vivid. I had learned that survival required vigilance, discernment, and an unwavering commitment to truth, even when those closest to me urged silence. Grandma's intentions were complex, layered with love, fear, and tradition, but the reality was undeniable. Silence had a price. And as I prepared to confront the next stage of this unfolding story, I knew that the road ahead would demand courage, clarity, and the willingness to face not only my cousin, but the entire family's complicity in the dangerous web of denial. The breaking point arrived unexpectedly, a moment that felt both sudden and inevitable, as though the tension that had been coiling in my chest for weeks had finally snapped. It was a quiet evening in late August, the kind of late summer night where the air is thick but still carries the scent of fresh-cut grass. Grandma had invited a few cousins over for dinner, a small gathering that should have been ordinary. I was still tender from the rib fractures, moving cautiously across the living room, when I noticed Jason lingering near the back door, his expression dark and unreadable. Something in the set of his shoulders, the twitch of his jaw, told me that the underlying hostility from before hadn't vanished. It had only been simmering, waiting for a spark. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation that warned me this night would not end quietly. The initial exchange seemed innocuous enough. Jason made a comment about me being overly dramatic about the injury, attempting to turn the situation into a joke. I bristled. The tension in my ribs amplified the discomfort in my body. I opened my mouth to respond calmly, but words faltered under the weight of unspoken history. Grandma, sitting nearby, immediately intervened, her voice sharp but trembling. "Don't start anything. Just let it go, Lena." Her plea, though meant to protect, felt like a chain around my chest. It was as if she was asking me to erase weeks of pain and betrayal with nothing more than a whisper of compliance. For a moment, I considered obeying, just to keep the fragile semblance of peace intact. But something inside me, a flicker of anger, of self-preservation, insisted that I could no longer pretend everything was fine. The moment escalated quickly. Jason, perhaps sensing my hesitation, stepped closer, his presence looming over me in the confined space of the living room. He muttered something intelligible under his breath and swung a small wooden object he had picked up from the floor. I ducked instinctively, but the movement jarred my ribs, sending a searing pain radiating through my chest. I stumbled backward, clutching my side, gasping for air. Other cousins froze, unsure how to react. While Grandma's hands went to her mouth in horror, "Lena, don't make a scene," she cried again, her voice a mixture of fear and desperation. But the scene had already been made. Pain and fear collided in a single instant, making the truth undeniable. Pretending, silencing, or rationalizing the situation was no longer an option. The old way of surviving within the family's unspoken rules had failed. Something had to change.
The breaking point wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a sudden clarity that the patterns of denial and protection around me could no longer contain the reality of what had happened. I realized that every whispered plea for silence, every insistence that family appearances mattered more than safety, had contributed to a dangerous environment where violence could recur unchecked. I understood that I was no longer negotiating merely with Jason's aggression, but with a broader, systemic pattern that had allowed him to act without consequence. Grandma's well-meaning attempts to maintain harmony had unintentionally reinforced a culture where truth was suppressed, leaving me with two options: endure silently or confront the situation head-on. For the first time, I understood that choosing silence was no longer viable. My survival, my dignity, and the very recognition of the harm done depended on me acknowledging and confronting it. As the evening progressed, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. I noticed subtle reactions from other cousins, fleeting glances and cautious movements that mirrored the unspoken acknowledgement of danger. It wasn't just me. Everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells, navigating a delicate balance between loyalty, fear, and curiosity. Their hesitancy underscored the complexity of the situation. This was not simply a personal conflict with Jason, but a broader, systemic pattern that had allowed him to act without consequence. Grandma's well-meaning attempts to maintain harmony had unintentionally reinforced a culture where truth was suppressed, leaving me with two options: endure silently or confront the situation head-on. For the first time, I understood that choosing silence was no longer viable. My survival, my dignity, and the very recognition of the harm done depended on me acknowledging and confronting it.
As the evening progressed, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. I noticed subtle reactions from other cousins, fleeting glances and cautious movements that mirrored the unspoken acknowledgement of danger. It wasn't just me. Everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells, navigating a delicate balance between loyalty, fear, and curiosity. Their hesitancy underscored the complexity of the situation. This was not simply a personal conflict with Jason, but a broader systemic pattern that had allowed him to act without consequence. The realization that I was not alone in recognizing the truth added to my resolve. I understood that if I acted decisively, I could begin to shift the family dynamic, or at the very least, ensure that the reality of the situation was no longer buried under layers of pretense and fear. The incident that evening also highlighted how deep the stakes were. Grandma's insistence on silence had been repeated over and over, yet it was clear that it was failing. The threat of physical harm was real, and so was the emotional toll of being forced to hide it. Each movement, each cautious breath reminded me of the fragility of my position and the urgency of documenting everything. By the end of the night, I returned to my bedroom exhausted, my body aching and my mind racing. I began to write in my journal with renewed purpose, recounting not just the events themselves, but also the feelings that had accompanied them. Fear, betrayal, confusion, and a simmering determination. This act of documentation was no longer just a personal coping mechanism, it became a crucial tool, a means of preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the truth. The CT scan had made the physical evidence undeniable, but the written record was now forming the emotional and psychological evidence I would need. That night, I also started to reconsider the relationships around me. It wasn't just Jason whose actions required scrutiny. It was the broader family dynamic that had allowed such violence to occur and remain partially hidden. I reflected on previous incidents that had seemed minor at the time. Harsh words dismissed as kids being kids. Small physical scuffles that ended with apologies and no consequences. Patterns emerged, revealing a consistent thread of avoidance, minimization, and insistence on maintaining appearances. This insight was painful, but it clarified the stakes. The breaking point was not a single swing of a bat. It was the culmination of years of denial, of safety being subordinated to appearances, and of my own willingness to comply with rules that prioritized comfort over truth. By the early hours of the next morning, I had resolved that things could not continue as they were. I had survived the physical assault, but the emotional and moral responsibility to confront the truth had now shifted squarely onto me. Pretending the incident was an isolated accident would not suffice. I needed to take action, gather evidence, and prepare myself for the inevitable resistance from those who prefer silence over accountability. The breaking point had arrived, and it had stripped away any illusion that I could remain passive. The old way of coping was gone. From that moment forward, I understood that reclaiming my safety, my voice, and the integrity of the truth would be a battle that required courage, strategy, and unwavering resolve. The first real shift in the story came a few days after that fateful night, when it became clear that what had happened could no longer be contained by whispers and avoidance. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, still tender from the rib fractures, reviewing my journal entries from the past few weeks, when my phone buzzed with a message from my friend Mara. She had noticed the large bandages peeking out from under my shirt and the way I moved cautiously through hallways. Her message was simple but pointed. "Lena, are you okay? You're not hiding something, are you?" I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to keep everything buried. Grandma's insistence on secrecy echoed in my mind. But another, stronger part recognized that the story could no longer be hidden. Something had changed. My ribs had healed enough to remind me of the fragility of silence, and I knew that external eyes seeing the truth could be the turning point. It was that same evening that my uncle, my mother's younger brother who lived in a neighboring town, called unexpectedly. His voice carried a tone of quiet concern tinged with suspicion. He said, "I heard about what happened with Jason. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Somehow, word of the incident had traveled, maybe through another relative, maybe through neighbors who had seen the chaos that day. His concern was genuine, but it marked a turning point. The external world was now watching, and the illusion of a private family secret was unraveling. For the first time, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that someone else recognized the gravity of what had occurred, dread because the involvement of others would bring inevitable scrutiny and confrontation.
The next morning, Grandma seemed unusually tense. She kept glancing toward the living room, muttering under her breath about making sure nobody says anything. But she also made another subtle admission, almost like a crack in the wall of denial. She encouraged me to rest, to let the doctors advise what to do next. I realized then that the pressure to suppress the truth was waning. The presence of outside concern, the call from my uncle, the probing message from Mara had shifted the dynamic. For the first time, I felt a sense of agency beyond the house's walls. This was the point of no return. The incident could no longer remain invisible. People had started to see the truth, and the veneer of family secrecy was beginning to peel away. That day, I decided to gather the most objective evidence I could. I retrieved the CT scan images from the hospital's portal, printed copies of my journal entries, and photos I had taken of the bruises that had formed after the bat swing. Each piece of evidence felt like armor, tangible proof that the story could not be denied. I carefully organized the materials, cataloging dates, descriptions, and sequences of events. The process was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it also provided clarity. For weeks, my experience had existed as a confusing mix of fear, pain, and frustration. Now, the facts were concrete, undeniable, and prepared for scrutiny. I knew that once this evidence was in the hands of someone who could act objectively, the trajectory of the story and my family's dynamics would change irreversibly. The first significant confrontation came unexpectedly that afternoon. My uncle, along with my older cousin Mariana, someone I'd always trusted for guidance, arrived at the house unannounced. Their expressions were serious, and I immediately sensed that the conversation would not allow for avoidance. Mariana knelt beside me, her hands gently resting on mine. "Lena, we need to understand exactly what happened," she said, her voice calm but firm. I hesitated, looking toward Grandma, who was pacing nervously in the background, but there was no turning back. I began recounting the events from the day of the assault, detailing every swing of the bat, every plea for calm, and every moment of denial that followed. I watched as Mariana and my uncle listened intently, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, and observing the evidence I had assembled. Their presence transformed the narrative from a private, silenced trauma into a matter of documented reality. Jason, of course, was present at the time, hovering near the doorway with a defensive expression. The first flicker of accountability in his eyes appeared only when he noticed the CT scan images laid out on the table. The visual proof of the damage he had caused could not be disputed. My uncle's and Mariana's attentive and impartial gaze created a pressure Jason had never faced before. It was as if the universe had suddenly tilted, forcing recognition and confrontation. The dynamic had shifted. The first external observers were now evaluating the situation objectively, and the concealment that had protected him was failing. I felt a mix of anxiety and vindication. Anxiety because the confrontation was inevitable. Vindication because truth was finally being acknowledged in a setting that could not be ignored. Grandma, though visibly uncomfortable, also shifted her position during the discussion. While she had previously begged me not to make a scene, her role as a caregiver and mediator compelled her to witness the evidence rather than continue to deny it. She hovered near the doorway, wringing her hands but listening, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was a subtle but important change. Even the most ardent defender of secrecy could no longer maintain absolute control over the narrative. The first cracks in the family's protective wall of silence had formed, and they were wide enough to let in accountability. By the end of the afternoon, the reality of the situation had begun to settle in for everyone.
Jason's initial defensiveness gave way to reluctant acknowledgement, while Grandma seemed to grapple with the tension between love and moral responsibility. Mariana and my uncle offered to guide the next steps, suggesting professional intervention and continued documentation. It was no longer merely my personal struggle. External eyes were now bearing witness, creating an objective layer of scrutiny that could not be dismissed. For the first time since the attack, I felt a flicker of hope. The point of no return had arrived. The truth had begun to move beyond the private walls of the family, and the cover-up that had shielded Jason was unraveling. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the changes that had occurred. The old strategy of silence, compliance, and avoidance had been rendered obsolete by external observation and evidence. I realized that the path forward would not be easy. Confrontation, accountability, and emotional upheaval were inevitable. But for the first time, I also understood that this was necessary, not only for my own safety, but for the integrity of family relationships and the broader lesson about accountability and truth. The first plot point had been reached. The outside world had seen the truth, and there was no turning back. The journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but the momentum had shifted, and I was ready to follow it wherever it led.
After the initial confrontation with my uncle and Mariana, I thought that finally, perhaps, a path toward resolution had opened. I had believed that once the truth was seen by impartial eyes, accountability would naturally follow, and the weight of secrecy would start to lift. But reality proved far more complicated. The moment the first external witnesses became involved, the undercurrents of opposition began to swell, subtle at first, and then increasingly overt. It wasn't just Jason anymore. It was the entire network of silence, denial, and protective instincts within my family, all rallying to defend the fragile illusion that nothing serious had happened. I quickly realized that telling the truth wasn't a single event. It was a process, and every step toward clarity would be met with resistance. The tension became palpable during the following family dinner, which Grandma had insisted on hosting, despite the ongoing drama. The moment I entered the dining room, I could feel the shift in energy. Cousins, who had once been cheerful and talkative, were now quiet, their glances fleeting and anxious. Jason sat at the far end of the table, his posture rigid, his eyes darting toward me intermittently with a mixture of anger and unease. Grandma's hands shook slightly as she served the dishes, whispering instructions to others to stay calm and don't mention anything. It was a delicate dance of appearances, everyone aware of the truth, but moving as if nothing had happened. I realized that the internal conflict wasn't mine alone. It was now infecting the household. Every action, every word, every glance was loaded with tension, a silent negotiation between acknowledgement and denial. I had stepped into a battlefield where the opposition wasn't just an individual, it was the family system itself, and it had been trained for years to protect its own. Jason's behavior during dinner was unpredictable. He would start speaking normally, attempting casual conversation, then abruptly shut down or shoot me a glare when I responded. I could sense his internal struggle, the same conflict I felt mirrored back at me. He knew that the truth was out, yet he sought any avenue to minimize, rationalize, or deflect. Every small interaction became a test of patience and observation. I found myself walking on eggshells, aware that any misstep could trigger another flare of aggression. But unlike before, I was prepared. I had my journal, my CT scan, and my photographic evidence at the ready. The awareness that my own documentation could serve as both shield and sword provided a cautious confidence. I no longer needed to rely solely on memory or Grandma's assurances. The objective evidence was my ally, and with it I could navigate the tension strategically rather than reactively. Yet the opposition was not passive. Whispered conversations behind closed doors, subtle attempts to invalidate my perspective, and gentle pressure from certain relatives began to test my resolve. Maybe it wasn't that bad, one cousin suggested quietly during a hallway encounter, eyes darting nervously as if fearing reprisal for speaking at all. You're probably overreacting, another said, attempting a casual dismissal.
Even Grandma, though supportive in private, struggled to balance her protective instincts with the push from other family members to maintain harmony. It became clear that revealing the truth was not just a matter of stating facts, it was an emotional and psychological struggle against deeply ingrained family dynamics that favored silence over accountability. I realized that rising opposition could come from anywhere, from direct confrontation to subtle undermining, and I had to be prepared for both. The first major escalation occurred when Jason directly confronted me one afternoon in the backyard. He approached with his usual mix of anger and uncertainty, muttering that he didn't deserve the attention and that everyone was overreacting. I stood my ground, my ribs still tender, but my resolve stronger than ever. I calmly referenced the CT scan, the documented bruises, and the journal entries I had prepared. His eyes flickered with recognition of the undeniable truth, yet his pride and fear of accountability fueled a defensive response. He yelled, stomped, and then stormed off, leaving me shaking, but resolute. That moment crystallized the reality. Opposition would escalate as the truth became unavoidable, and every effort to deflect or intimidate would intensify as long as I remained firm. In the following days, the psychological pressure increased. Family members alternated between subtle manipulation and outright guilt-tripping into silence. Think about Grandma's feelings, one would say. Jason didn't mean to hurt you, another insisted. Even as I recognized these tactics, they cut deep, preying on my empathy, my love for my family, and the lingering instinct to preserve peace. Yet every time the pressure mounted, I returned to the evidence, the CT scan images, the photos, the detailed journal entries. Each piece of proof was a reminder that my experience was real and that the rising opposition, no matter how persuasive, could not erase the facts. I began to see opposition as a test of courage and commitment, a necessary crucible to prove the strength of my voice against the forces of denial. During this period, I also noticed that support began to coalesce quietly around me. Mariana and my uncle provided guidance and reassurance, helping me navigate the delicate balance of asserting the truth while minimizing risk. Some cousins, hesitant at first, began expressing subtle solidarity in small gestures, a nod of recognition, a whispered word of encouragement, or simply choosing to sit near me instead of avoiding me entirely. Their presence, though quiet, reminded me that opposition was not absolute. There were allies willing to acknowledge the truth even when others resisted. This fragile network of support became a source of strength, a reminder that truth, once recognized, could not be fully contained by fear or familial pressure.
By the end of the week, I had developed a clear strategy: maintain calm, document interactions, and assert boundaries while navigating the rising opposition. Every encounter with Jason or other family members was a test, and every whispered attempt to manipulate or diminish my experience was a reminder that the fight for acknowledgement was ongoing. The process was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it was also empowering. I had moved from being a passive participant in a culture of denial to an active agent defending truth. The rising opposition was real, and it was fierce, but with clarity, documentation, and support, I felt prepared to confront it, knowing that every act of resistance brought me closer to the eventual reckoning that the family and Jason could no longer avoid. The midpoint of my ordeal arrived like a lightning strike, sudden, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the reality of the situation crystallized in a way that left no room for denial or minimization. I had returned to the hospital for a follow-up visit, primarily to check on the healing of my ribs, but this appointment would become the turning point that changed everything. Dr. Patel, the radiologist overseeing my recovery, reviewed the CT scans with a seriousness that made my chest tighten, not from physical pain, but from the weight of the moment. He leaned over the light box, pointing to the fractures with a calm precision that contrasted sharply with the chaos they represented. "Lena," he said quietly, "these aren't minor injuries. Multiple ribs are shattered, and some fragments are displaced. If this had gone unnoticed longer, the consequences could have been life-threatening."
His words landed with a gravity that made me shiver, not from cold, but from the unmistakable truth they carried. The evidence was undeniable, objective, and irrefutable. For the first time, the injuries I had suffered could no longer be brushed aside or rationalized away, not by Jason, not by Grandma, not by anyone who hoped silence could erase what had happened. As Dr. Patel explained the medical details, I realized that this moment represented more than just a health assessment. It was proof that the danger I had faced was real, tangible, and documented. The CT scans, once simply images on a screen, had transformed into concrete evidence that could no longer be dismissed. I remembered Grandma's earlier pleas to keep the family peace and the subtle pressures from cousins who hoped I would minimize or forget the attack. In comparison, these scans offered an impartial reality, something that existed outside of subjective family narratives and protective instincts. I felt a surge of vindication, a quiet satisfaction that the truth I had clung to, recorded in journal entries and photographs, was now validated by experts who had no personal stake in the story. The undeniable proof was a shield, a validation, and a weapon all at once, and I knew the next steps would require courage, strategy, and careful planning. Returning home with copies of the scans in hand, I immediately noticed the shift in my family's behavior. Jason, sensing the weight of what had been documented, became quieter, less confrontational. There were fleeting moments of tension in his eyes, quick glances that betrayed a new awareness. He could no longer pretend the incident was insignificant. Even Grandma, who had long advocated for silence, seemed uneasy, her attempts to downplay the situation faltering against the irrefutable evidence now circulating within the household. I realized that this was the turning point I had been waiting for. The undeniable proof had broken through the web of denial, shifting the balance of power. The narrative that had once been controlled by silence and avoidance was now fundamentally altered. The truth could not be ignored, and everyone in the house could feel it. The undeniable proof also had a psychological impact on Jason beyond his initial discomfort. I noticed his posture shift, the defensiveness replaced with uncertainty, his habitual smirk absent from casual interactions. Every word he spoke, every attempt to downplay past events, was countered internally by the knowledge that objective evidence existed, waiting to be referenced. I realized then that truth has a unique power. It doesn't argue or threaten, it simply exists, and in doing so, it demands recognition. For the first time, I felt a profound sense of empowerment. The journey from being a passive victim to an active participant in asserting reality had reached a pivotal moment. I was no longer relying solely on memory or subjective accounts. The evidence itself was undeniable, and it fundamentally changed the dynamics of confrontation. With the scans in hand, I began to prepare for what I knew would come next, the confrontation that could no longer be avoided. I reviewed my journal, aligning written observations with the objective medical evidence. Each entry, each photograph, each page of documentation reinforced the reality of what had occurred. I thought about the conversations with my uncle and Mariana, the subtle acknowledgments of cousins who had quietly sided with me, and the mounting unease in Grandma's demeanor. The alignment of personal records with professional medical evidence created a comprehensive and irrefutable account of the events, a narrative that could not be silenced, spun, or dismissed. The realization was both daunting and invigorating. I understood that I had entered a new phase. The undeniable proof had emerged, and the journey towards confrontation and resolution could no longer be delayed.
That evening, as I carefully organized the scans and journal entries on my desk, I felt a mixture of fear, anticipation, and determination. I knew that presenting this evidence to others, family members, authorities, or even friends who could provide support, would escalate tensions. Yet it was also the moment where the story could no longer be twisted or denied. For weeks, subtle manipulation, denial, and avoidance had shaped the narrative. Now, the objective truth stood firmly in place, ready to confront the lies and protective instincts that had enabled harm. I understood that this was the fulcrum upon which everything would pivot. The undeniable proof was no longer just medical documentation, it was the turning point that would force action, demand accountability, and expose the reality that had been concealed for far too long.
As I closed my notebook and gazed at the neatly organized evidence, I felt a sense of calm determination. The midpoint of my journey had arrived, and with it, a clarity that was both empowering and terrifying. I had faced pain, fear, and isolation, but the emergence of undeniable proof meant that my voice could no longer be dismissed. The next steps, confronting Jason, addressing family dynamics, and navigating the fallout, would be difficult, but they were now unavoidable. The proof had shattered the illusions of denial and silence, and with it the story had entered its turning point. There was no going back. The undeniable truth was here, and it would guide every action, every decision, and every confrontation that lay ahead. The moment I had been anticipating and dreading arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, as I sat on the edge of my bed, reviewing the CT scans and journal entries one more time. I knew the undeniable proof had shifted the power of the narrative, but the true test would be whether I could act decisively, whether I could finally stop protecting the illusions and comfort of others and speak the truth fully. For weeks, I had internalized Grandma's pleas, Jason's apologies, and the subtle manipulations of the extended family, all of which had pressured me to maintain silence. Now, staring at the cold, objective reality in front of me, I felt the weight of decision pressing down like a physical force. This was it, the point of no return. To remain silent any longer would be complicity, and to act would mean confronting both the family's denial and Jason's aggression directly. The choice was terrifying, but it was necessary. That evening, I made the decision to call Mariana and my uncle over, requesting a family meeting that would include Grandma, Jason, and the few other relatives who had been subtly observing the tension for weeks. My hands trembled slightly as I sent the message, knowing that it would escalate everything in ways that couldn't be controlled. I spent the next hour organizing my materials once more, placing the CT scans, photographs, and journal entries neatly on the table so that nothing could be dismissed or overlooked. I felt a sense of empowerment in this preparation. For the first time, I was no longer reacting to the family's secrecy, but actively shaping the narrative, asserting control over how the truth would be presented. Still, beneath that empowerment was fear, the fear of confrontation, of retaliation, of the emotional storm I knew was coming. When Mariana and my uncle arrived, the air in the house shifted immediately. Jason, who had been lingering near the doorway, tensed visibly. Grandma's face was pale, her hands clenching and unclenching as she tried to maintain composure. I took a deep breath and began, explaining calmly and clearly the events of the bat incident, referencing the objective evidence alongside my personal account. The CT scans were laid flat on the table, each image a stark representation of the injuries I had endured. I described the sequence of events, the subtle threats, the moments of silence and manipulation, and the psychological pressure I had felt from family members insisting I keep the peace. Mariana nodded, jotting notes, while my uncle observed quietly, offering the occasional clarifying question. The room felt charged, as if every unspoken word from the past weeks had accumulated and now demanded recognition. Jason's reaction was immediate and visceral. He attempted to interrupt, to downplay, to rationalize, insisting that the swings of the bat had been accidental, that I had exaggerated my pain, and that everyone was overreacting. But each claim he made collided with the irrefutable evidence before him. The CT scans, photographs, and detailed journal entries could not be disputed or ignored. I stayed calm, presenting facts without emotional escalation, letting the evidence speak louder than words or emotions. Jason's defenses began to crack under the weight of objective reality. His voice, once confident and dismissive, wavered, revealing for the first time genuine recognition of the consequences of his actions. The moment was tense, electrified with fear, shame, and the undeniable power of truth. Grandma, though still visibly shaken, could no longer plead for silence. The evidence had left her with a choice: continue attempting to suppress reality, or acknowledge what had happened and help navigate the consequences responsibly. She remained silent for several long minutes, watching the interplay of acknowledgement and resistance, finally nodding towards me, a subtle but powerful signal that she understood I was no longer protecting her comfort over the truth. It was a moment of shift, a recognition that my courage to speak, bolstered by evidence and resolve, could change long-standing dynamics. For weeks, she had been the voice insisting I keep the peace, but the undeniable proof had altered the moral calculus. She could no longer demand silence without confronting reality herself.
The conversation grew more intense as Jason's guilt collided with his defensiveness. He admitted fragments of responsibility, the words emerging halting at first, then gaining momentum as he struggled to articulate the full scope of his actions. He tried to rationalize, to explain, to justify, but each attempt was countered by the CT scans, the bruises, and the detailed recounting of events I had prepared. The turning point crystallized. There was no longer any hiding. No rationalization could erase the harm, and no argument could reverse the visual and documented proof of the assault. I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion, knowing that the confrontation was necessary, unavoidable, and, ultimately, liberating. By the end of the discussion, the room was tense but transformed. Jason had acknowledged wrongdoing. Grandma had shifted from insisting on silence to a reluctant recognition of the truth, and Mariana and my uncle had established a plan to ensure accountability while protecting my safety. The act of speaking, presenting evidence, and refusing to shield others from the consequences had completed a critical stage in the journey. The choice to speak had been terrifying, but it was the essential pivot from secrecy and denial to acknowledgement and action. I had crossed the threshold, no longer a passive participant in a culture of silence. I had fully confronted the truth, and in doing so, set the stage for the family to reckon with the consequences of inaction. That night, lying in bed with ribs still tender but mind racing, I reflected on the significance of the moment. Speaking the truth was not simply a matter of moral clarity. It was a practical, necessary act to ensure safety, accountability, and justice. The all-is-lost tension I had felt, the fear, the doubt, the uncertainty of whether anyone would stand with me had culminated in this decisive act of courage. I understood that the journey ahead would be difficult, with further confrontations, resistance, and emotional fallout. But the hardest step had been taken. I had chosen truth over fear, courage over compliance, and acknowledgement over silence. The decision to speak had altered everything, marking the turning point that would guide the next phase of reckoning, confrontation, and eventual resolution. The confrontation that had begun in a controlled, evidence-backed setting quickly escalated into something far more intense than I had anticipated. Once Jason realized that the truth was no longer a private secret, the opposition grew more overt, more threatening, and more manipulative, as if the denial that had once protected him was now morphing into anger and intimidation. The following days were a blur of tense encounters, hushed warnings, and carefully navigated interactions, each one testing my resolve and my ability to maintain composure under pressure. Jason's behavior shifted from subtle guilt and avoidance to direct confrontation. He would linger near my room, block my path in hallways, and mutter sharp, cutting remarks designed to unnerve me. Every action felt calculated to instill fear and uncertainty, yet every glance I cast toward my prepared evidence reminded me that his attempts at intimidation would ultimately fail against undeniable truth. Grandma, caught in the middle, tried to mediate, but her own fear and loyalty to Jason made her interventions inconsistent. At times, she would echo her old pleas, urging calm and restraint, and at other moments she would simply watch silently, aware that the dynamic in the house had fundamentally shifted. The tension created a constant psychological pressure that made ordinary tasks, walking through the living room, eating dinner, even answering casual questions, feel like navigating a minefield. I quickly learned that the second pinch point wasn't just about direct confrontation. It was about the cumulative, subtle pressures that threatened to wear me down over time. Every whispered threat, every sidelong glance, every attempt at emotional manipulation was part of the opposition's strategy to regain control of the narrative. It became clear that maintaining strength, composure, and reliance on evidence was essential to survive and ultimately prevail. The first direct escalation occurred one afternoon when Jason confronted me in the backyard, moments after Mariana had left with my uncle. His face was tight with frustration, eyes darting in a mix of fear and anger. He began yelling, accusing me of trying to turn everyone against him and exaggerating the extent of the injuries. His words were sharp, designed to provoke fear and self-doubt, but I stood my ground, calmly pointing to the evidence I had gathered. The CT scans, photographs of bruises, and my meticulously detailed journal entries. As I presented each piece of evidence, I noticed a shift in his stance.
The aggression faltered as the objective truth became undeniable, forcing him to confront the consequences of his own actions. This confrontation reinforced the lesson I had learned in previous days. The opposition would escalate as long as the truth threatened the fragile illusion he had relied on for so long. The intensity of the mounting pressure wasn't limited to Jason. Other family members began to take sides, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly. Some attempted to diminish my experience with phrases like, "It wasn't that bad," or "Why are you making such a big deal?" Others provided quiet but critical support, offering validation through gestures, attentive listening, or willingness to participate in discussions about next steps. The polarization created a charged environment in which every interaction became a test of judgment and endurance. I quickly learned that mounting pressure was not only external, but internal. My own doubts, fears, and memories of past silences threatened to undermine my confidence. Recognizing this internal resistance as part of the opposition allowed me to compartmentalize and focus on the facts, the evidence, and the ultimate goal of accountability and truth.
During this period, the psychological tactics used by Jason became more sophisticated. He would attempt to redirect blame, make vague threats about social consequences, or appeal to Grandma's fear of family reputation to destabilize my resolve. At times, he insinuated that I had overstepped boundaries, subtly implying that my pursuit of justice would fracture the family irreparably. The stakes were rising, not only in terms of immediate confrontation, but in the broader battle over family loyalty, narrative control, and moral responsibility. I realized that every act of defiance, every steadfast commitment to truth, was now a direct challenge to a system of silence and denial that had governed the family for years. It was not just about proving Jason's culpability, it was about asserting the principle that truth could not be ignored or suppressed indefinitely. I found solace and strategic guidance in Mariana and my uncle, whose quiet support and advice provided an anchor during the storm of mounting pressure. They helped me structure conversations, anticipate manipulative tactics, and present evidence in ways that were assertive but not reactive. With their guidance, I learned to maintain composure even in moments when Jason's aggression became overtly threatening. I also realized the importance of documenting every interaction, not just the original assault, as each encounter became part of a cumulative narrative of resistance, intimidation, and acknowledgement. The growing evidence trail would serve not only to reinforce my own confidence, but also to establish an unassailable account that could be relied upon if further intervention became necessary. By the end of the week, the mounting pressure had reached a tipping point. The household dynamic had changed irrevocably. Jason, while still resistant, had to reckon with the reality of undeniable proof and the steadfast resolve I displayed in defending it. Grandma's role as mediator had shifted from insisting on silence to cautiously facilitating acknowledgement of the facts. The rest of the family, aware of the confrontation in the evidence, had been forced to recognize the seriousness of the situation. I felt a mix of exhaustion and empowerment. The psychological and emotional toll of rising opposition was intense, but the clarity that truth could no longer be suppressed provided a sense of forward momentum. Every act of pressure, every manipulation, had ultimately reinforced the necessity of remaining steadfast and unwavering. In those days, I understood that the second pinch point was a crucible, a test of endurance, courage, and moral clarity. The opposition was relentless, escalating with each assertion of truth, but each confrontation also strengthened my resolve and sharpened my strategy. By confronting intimidation with evidence and composure, I began to see that pressure could be transformed from a tool of fear into a catalyst for empowerment. The mounting pressure had revealed not only the stakes involved, but also the strength I possessed to navigate them. The moment was exhausting, harrowing, and formative, a defining stage in the journey toward confrontation, accountability, and eventual resolution.
The days following the confrontation were some of the darkest I had ever experienced, the emotional weight pressing down on me as though it had taken physical form. Speaking the truth, presenting evidence, and refusing to shield anyone from the consequences of their actions had been necessary, but the fallout was immediate and overwhelming. Jason's anger and resentment had intensified, manifesting in constant tension throughout the house, veiled threats and biting comments designed to make me question my own perception of events. Every room I entered carried a palpable heaviness, every glance a subtle challenge, and every whispered conversation behind closed doors seemed like a coordinated effort to isolate me psychologically. The emotional toll was compounded by my physical state. My ribs were still healing, every breath a reminder of the violence I had endured, and every movement a test of endurance. It felt as if the act of asserting truth had opened a floodgate of consequences I was unprepared for, leaving me vulnerable in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Grandma, who had once been my protector in some ways, now seemed to waver between support and self-preservation. She would offer moments of comfort, a hand on my shoulder or a quiet word of encouragement, but they were fleeting, often interrupted by reminders to be careful or don't push too hard. Her shifting loyalties reflected the tension that had always existed between protecting family reputation and acknowledging reality. I understood her fear. She was trying to maintain a semblance of peace while navigating the uncomfortable truth. But it also magnified my sense of isolation. The very person who had once begged me to not make a scene was now partially supportive, yet unable to fully shield me from the backlash. It was a difficult balance to witness, knowing she loved me but could not entirely escape the gravity of what had been revealed. Her internal struggle became a mirror for the larger family dynamics, illustrating how entrenched denial and loyalty could complicate even the most straightforward pursuit of justice.
The emotional and psychological strain of this period was compounded by subtle social consequences. Relatives who had once interacted with me casually began to distance themselves, unsure of how to navigate the tension or fearful of taking a side in a conflict that had suddenly escalated beyond ordinary family disputes. Friends outside the family expressed concern, but the thought of the confrontation spilling into public awareness added another layer of anxiety. I began to question my own choices at night, replaying interactions in my mind, wondering if I had handled the conversations correctly, whether I had pushed too hard or failed to assert myself sufficiently. Doubts crept in, challenging the resolve that had carried me through the initial confrontation. It was a lonely, disorienting experience. The very act of seeking truth had triggered a maelstrom of emotional, social, and psychological consequences that left me exhausted and uncertain. At the same time, Jason's hostility became more direct. He would follow me through rooms, make pointed remarks about ruining family unity, and sometimes escalate to yelling, using the house as a theater of intimidation. Every word he spoke was loaded with aggression, every glance an implicit threat, designed to make me question whether standing firm had been worth it. I felt isolated, the weight of the confrontation pressing not only on my physical body, but on my sense of security and peace. The allies I had counted on, Mariana and my uncle, could not be present constantly, and Grandma, while sympathetic, could not fully shield me from the storm of hostility. For the first time since the incident, I truly felt the cost of telling the truth. Fear, isolation, emotional exhaustion, and the constant need to defend oneself against psychological and social assaults. The low point was not a single moment, but a cumulative weight pressing down, a recognition that speaking out had consequences far beyond my initial anticipation. In those days, I also confronted the lingering guilt of breaking the family silence. For so long, I had internalized the idea that keeping quiet preserved peace, that making accusations would fracture relationships irreparably. Now, with undeniable evidence in hand and confrontation unavoidable, I grappled with the moral tension of having chosen truth over avoidance. I loved my family, Yet I had forced them to face a reality they would have preferred to ignore. Every glance from Grandma, every whispered conversation in hallways, every subtle withdrawal from cousins reminded me that my decision had real, tangible consequences for the household. The guilt was a heavy companion, weighing alongside fear and physical pain, reminding me that accountability is rarely comfortable and courage is rarely without cost. Yet even in the midst of this emotional and physical storm, a quiet resilience began to emerge. I realized that the darkness I was experiencing was a natural consequence of stepping into the light, of refusing to hide from reality any longer. Each instance of hostility, every attempt to intimidate or manipulate me became a test of endurance, a challenge to remain steadfast. I learned to compartmentalize fear, to focus on the objective evidence and the knowledge that my account was valid and supported by professionals and trusted allies. The darkest days, though exhausting and painful, were also formative, teaching me the true cost of integrity, the fragility of relationships under pressure, and the importance of unwavering commitment to truth. It was a crucible, a period of trial that would ultimately prepare me for the final confrontation to come. By the end of the week, the emotional and physical toll had reached its peak. Nights were restless, filled with racing thoughts and occasional tears. Days were tense, punctuated by confrontation, subtle manipulation, and the lingering weight of guilt and fear. Yet, despite the exhaustion, a quiet clarity had begun to form. This was a necessary stage, a low point that could not be avoided. The darkness of this period illuminated the stakes, the courage required, and the value of what I had already accomplished. I had spoken the truth, presented evidence, and begun to assert my voice against a network of denial and intimidation. The emotional and physical cost was high, but it was proof that real change, real accountability required resilience and unwavering commitment. The lowest point had been reached, and in that darkness, the path forward, though daunting, became undeniable. The day of the final confrontation arrived with a weight I could feel in every fiber of my body, as if the anticipation itself had tightened around my chest. Months of pain, fear, secrecy, and subtle psychological warfare had built to this moment, and there was no turning back. I had prepared meticulously, gathering all the evidence, reviewing my journal entries, and organizing the CT scans so that every detail could be presented clearly without room for denial or obfuscation. Mariana and my uncle had offered guidance, helping me rehearse explanations, anticipate defensive tactics, and maintain composure under pressure. Despite the preparation, my heart raced as I realized this was no longer about quiet family discussions or hushed interventions. It was a formal confrontation within our household, a public reckoning where the truth would finally be undeniable and every participant would have to take a stand.
I gathered my materials and called everyone to the living room, insisting that the discussion remain orderly and evidence-focused. Jason appeared tense, shoulders rigid, eyes darting as though he were measuring his own courage against mine. Grandma stood nearby, wringing her hands, visibly anxious but committed to staying present. Other family members, some reluctant, some curious, settled uneasily on the couch and chairs around us. The air was thick with anticipation and unspoken questions. I began calmly, explaining the sequence of events with as much clarity and detachment as I could muster. I pointed to the CT scans, showing each fracture, and referenced photographs and journal entries that documented bruises and interactions that had been ignored or minimized before. Every statement was deliberate, each piece of evidence presented to ensure the truth could not be disputed. I spoke steadily, feeling the quiet power of clarity as I guided the room through the undeniable reality of what had happened. Jason's reaction was immediate and layered, a mix of anger, guilt, and fear. He attempted to interrupt, to explain, to rationalize, insisting that I had misinterpreted events or exaggerated his actions. But I remained firm, calmly responding with facts and pointing directly to the documentation that refuted every attempt at denial.
The CT scans, detailed photographs, and thorough journal entries acted as an impartial authority, a visual and textual account that could not be rewritten. Each attempt at rationalization crumbled under the weight of evidence, and I could see the tension in Jason's face as the reality of his actions became unavoidable. His aggression was now tempered by recognition. He could no longer deny the consequences of what he had done, nor could he manipulate the narrative to protect himself. The confrontation was no longer a private dispute. It had become a trial by truth, and every participant had to confront it. Grandma, observing silently for much of the presentation, finally spoke, her voice quivering but resolute. She acknowledged the reality of the injuries and the courage it had taken to bring the truth forward. Her words were significant not only because of her role as matriarch, but also because they symbolized the broader shift within the family. The protective veil of silence and denial had been pierced, and her acknowledgement validated my actions while reinforcing the authority of the evidence. Even those relatives who had been reluctant or skeptical were now compelled to recognize the severity of the situation. The room, once charged with tension and uncertainty, began to settle into a collective awareness of truth. For the first time since the incident, the confrontation felt like a structured, almost judicial process where facts prevailed over fear and emotion, and where every participant was accountable for their perception and response. As the discussion progressed, I saw Jason's defenses weaken further. He alternated between denial and reluctant acknowledgement, his voice faltering as he tried to navigate a reality he had hoped to avoid. I maintained calm, resisting the instinct to argue emotionally, and allowed the evidence to speak for itself. Each CT scan, each photograph, each meticulously noted journal entry acted as a mirror reflecting his actions back at him in undeniable clarity. I realized that this formal confrontation was not only about my validation, but also about the broader consequences for him, an opportunity for accountability and reflection that could not be bypassed or ignored. It was a turning point where courage and truth outweighed fear and avoidance, forcing recognition and responsibility into the open. By the time the discussion concluded, a profound shift had taken place. Jason had admitted, partially and haltingly, the reality of his actions. Grandma, now more composed, had reaffirmed support while emphasizing the need for family accountability. The rest of the relatives, previously hesitant, had witnessed the undeniable evidence and were compelled to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. I felt a wave of relief and exhaustion, knowing that the confrontation had achieved its intended purpose. Truth had been presented, recognized, and validated. The room, once tense and charged with fear, now carried an air of cautious resolution. Every participant had been forced to confront the reality of the incident, to reckon with evidence, and to take a stand for honesty and accountability. As I packed up the CT scans and journal entries, I reflected on the journey that had led to this moment. The confrontation had been exhausting, emotionally and physically, but it had also been transformative. I had moved from fear, isolation, and subtle intimidation to a position of clarity, authority, and moral strength. Speaking the truth, presenting evidence, and standing firm had reshaped the dynamics of the household, forcing accountability and fostering recognition of reality. The final push had succeeded not through aggression or vengeance, but through preparation, calm, and unwavering commitment to fact and integrity. The climax had arrived, and with it, the promise of resolution, justice, and the potential for healing, not only for me, but for the family as a whole.
In the days following the confrontation, the household slowly began to shift toward a new equilibrium, though it was fragile and required constant attention. The undeniable evidence, once a source of tension and fear, had now become a foundation for accountability and reconciliation. Jason, while still grappling with the consequences of his actions, had entered a phase of tentative acknowledgement. He no longer denied the severity of the injuries or the impact of his aggression, and though he was quiet and cautious, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in his behavior. He began to take small steps toward responsibility, offering apologies that were hesitant but genuine, and refraining from the manipulative tactics that had once dominated our interactions. The shift, though slow, signaled the beginning of a new phase, the acknowledgement that truth, once revealed, cannot be undone, and that courage can reshape even long-standing patterns of denial and avoidance. Grandma's role also evolved during this period. The tension that had once dominated her interactions with me, her pleas for silence, her fear of disrupting family unity, gradually gave way to a more supportive presence. She began to assist with household dynamics in ways that encouraged accountability rather than suppression, helping to mediate conversations and maintain a level of calm while ensuring that evidence and acknowledgement remained central. It was clear that the confrontation had forced her to reevaluate her own priorities. The family's comfort and reputation could no longer take precedence over honesty and the well-being of those harmed. Her transformation was subtle but meaningful, a sign that even deeply ingrained patterns of protection and denial could be reshaped when confronted with unwavering truth and undeniable proof. I also noticed shifts in other family members who had been hesitant or resistant. Cousins and aunts who had previously whispered doubts or minimized the situation now engaged more openly, asking questions, offering support, and validating my experience. The CT scans, photographs, and journal entries that had once been points of contention now served as objective references that facilitated understanding and dialogue. What had been a private battle for recognition had transformed into a collective acknowledgement of reality. And while tensions and awkwardness remained, there was a growing sense that the family could navigate the truth without resorting to denial or manipulation. This emerging pattern of acknowledgement and support created a new social framework in the household, one where honesty was no longer optional and courage was recognized and valued. The shift in equilibrium was also deeply personal. I felt a profound sense of vindication and relief, knowing that the courage to speak, to present evidence, and to confront not only Jason, but the broader patterns of family denial had led to tangible change. The months of fear, isolation, and subtle intimidation had tested every aspect of my resilience. But emerging from that crucible, I recognized my own capacity for moral courage and endurance. The validation was not simply external, it was internal as well. A recognition that I had upheld my principles even under immense pressure and had forced accountability in a context that had long tolerated silence and avoidance. The empowerment was transformative, allowing me to approach interactions with confidence, clarity, and a renewed understanding of personal agency. As the household settled into this new equilibrium, practical consequences began to take shape. Jason faced clear boundaries regarding behavior, accountability, and interactions within the family. There were structured conversations, monitored interactions, and ongoing acknowledgement of the documented evidence that had served as the catalyst for change. These measures were not punitive in a vindictive sense, but were necessary to ensure safety, transparency, and a reestablishment of trust that had been broken. I observed with a sense of cautious optimism how the structure of accountability began to influence broader behavior patterns. Even the most resistant individuals started to recognize that truth was no longer negotiable and that integrity and courage carried weight in reshaping family dynamics. The sense of justice and vindication extended beyond immediate interpersonal dynamics. Friends outside the family, colleagues, and support networks validated the courage it had taken to maintain composure, gather evidence, and confront long-standing patterns of denial. The recognition that truth, when pursued with diligence and moral clarity, has the power to command respect, influence behavior, and catalyze change became a central theme in my reflection. I realized that the months of struggle, fear, and confrontation were not just about my personal safety or the correction of past wrongs. They were a testament to the broader principle that courage and integrity can shift entrenched systems, even when resistance and intimidation seem insurmountable. In private moments of reflection, I acknowledged the complexity of emotions that remained. Relief and empowerment were tempered by lingering sadness for the trust that had been broken, the familial bonds strained, and the months lost to fear and manipulation. Yet, these emotions coexisted with a deep appreciation for the lessons learned, the necessity of preparation, the importance of objective evidence, the power of moral courage, and the transformative effect of unwavering commitment to truth. The resolution, though still delicate and ongoing,
marked the beginning of a new chapter where honesty, accountability, and respect were central to interactions and relationships. It was a victory grounded not in vengeance or retaliation, but in the quiet, persistent assertion of truth and the courage to ensure it could not be ignored.
By the end of this period, the household had achieved a semblance of stability and moral clarity that had been absent for years. Accountability measures were in place, tensions had diminished, and acknowledgement of past harm created a foundation for rebuilding trust. Jason's gradual acceptance of responsibility, Grandma's supportive mediation, and the cautious but genuine engagement of other relatives signaled that the family had entered a new phase, one in which integrity and courage carried authority. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not simply for having survived the ordeal, but for having catalyzed a process of accountability and transformation that could extend beyond this single conflict. The resolution was real, tangible, and hard-won, and it offered a powerful validation of the courage, persistence, and moral clarity that had guided every step of the journey. The days that followed the resolution were quieter, yet they carried a weight of profound change that I could feel in every interaction, in every breath I took. The confrontation, the evidence, the unwavering insistence on truth, all of it had shifted the dynamics of the household, transforming not only relationships but also my sense of self. For the first time in months, I moved through my home without the undercurrent of fear or tension that had once dictated every glance, every step. Jason had accepted, however reluctantly, the consequences of his actions, and while the path towards true reconciliation would take time, there was an unmistakable shift in his behavior. He now approached interactions with a measured caution, a quiet acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and an emerging willingness to respect boundaries he had previously ignored. The air itself felt different, less charged, less threatening, more open to honesty and accountability. Grandma, who had once begged me to make no scene, now offered a steady presence that reflected both relief and pride. She spoke more openly about the importance of integrity and courage, acknowledging that her earlier insistence on silence had been misguided. Her support, tempered with wisdom earned from years of navigating family complexities, became a source of quiet guidance rather than pressure or manipulation. I realized that the transformation was not just my own. It was rippling outward, reshaping the behaviors and perspectives of those around me in ways subtle but lasting. The family itself began to settle into routines that reflected accountability and mutual respect. Conversations were no longer punctuated by veiled threats or whispered manipulations. Instead, there was a cautious openness, a willingness to engage in discussions grounded in honesty and supported by the evidence that had initiated the transformation. Even those relatives who had been initially skeptical or reluctant began to acknowledge the seriousness of what had happened, their behavior guided by a recognition that courage and truth demanded respect. The household, once a microcosm of denial, fear, and intimidation, had evolved into a space where integrity carried weight and accountability was no longer optional. The transformation was tangible, reflected in every glance, every conversation, and every deliberate choice to engage with honesty rather than avoidance. Personally, I felt a sense of empowerment that was both liberating and humbling. The months of fear, isolation, and subtle intimidation had forged a resilience I had not fully appreciated until now. I realized that courage is not the absence of fear, but the capacity to act in spite of it, to insist on truth even when the cost is high. The evidence I had gathered, the conversations I had navigated, and the confrontations I had endured were more than tactical steps. They were a testament to moral clarity, endurance, and the power of principled action. In private moments, I reflected on how far I had come, from vulnerability,
intimidation and uncertainty, to a place of agency, authority, and confidence. The scars, both physical and emotional, remained, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they served as markers of resilience, symbols of the journey I had endured and survived. Beyond the household, I began to recognize the broader impact of my actions. Sharing my experience with trusted friends, mentors, and supportive networks revealed the ripple effects of courage and integrity. People spoke of the inspiration they drew from witnessing my persistence and calm insistence on truth, recognizing that the principles of accountability, evidence, and moral fortitude could reshape situations far beyond a single incident. I realized that the lessons of this journey were universal. Fear, manipulation, and denial can dominate until someone dares to insist on clarity, to present evidence, and to act with unwavering moral conviction. In that sense, my personal transformation carried broader meaning, demonstrating the power of courage not just to protect oneself, but to catalyze change in systems, relationships, and communities. The physical reminders of the ordeal, my still healing ribs, the lingering aches, and the faint marks of bruises, served as constant but manageable reminders of what had been endured and overcome. Rather than signaling vulnerability, they had become badges of survival, visual affirmations of the resilience and tenacity required to confront injustice and insist on truth. Every breath that had once been painful now carried a quiet sense of liberation. Every step through the house was a declaration that the fear and intimidation of the past months no longer governed my life. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it perfect, but it was complete in the sense that I had reclaimed agency, established boundaries, and created a space where truth, integrity, and courage guided my interactions.
By the end of this period, I felt a profound sense of purpose emerging from the ordeal. My experience had taught me that courage is both a personal and communal act, that evidence and clarity are powerful tools in dismantling fear and denial, and that perseverance in the face of opposition can yield transformation far beyond initial expectations. I began to consider how this knowledge could serve not only my own life, but also others who might find themselves trapped in patterns of silence, intimidation, or manipulation. The scars and memories of the past months became instructive, guiding me toward advocacy, mentorship, and the sharing of strategies for asserting truth and accountability in difficult situations. Transformation, I realized, was not only about surviving an ordeal, but about emerging equipped to help others navigate similar challenges with confidence and courage. The final image of this journey is one of quiet strength and newfound purpose. I stand in the living room, ribs healed but memory intact, holding the journal and CT scans that had once been instruments of confrontation, now symbols of endurance and empowerment. The family, though still navigating adjustment, engages with honesty and mutual respect. Jason, cautious but accountable, has begun to rebuild relationships within the household, guided by acknowledgement and responsibility. Grandma, wiser and supportive, offers steady counsel rather than fear-driven directives. And I, having confronted fear, intimidation, and denial, have emerged with a deepened sense of agency, moral clarity, and the courage to advocate for truth and accountability in difficult situations. Transformation, I realized, was not only about surviving an ordeal, but about emerging equipped to help others navigate similar challenges with confidence and courage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.